Hi everyone, and welcome once again to our lesson on social change and the law. For this specific workshop, we are going to focus on the issues of feminism and how feminist perspectives brought about changes in the law. This particular lesson will then fit into another lesson that we will cover later on to look at the specific issue of feminism and feminist theories. But for this particular lesson, what we're going to look at is to look at the development of women's rights throughout history. Let's continue. We begin by exploring the historical development of how societies viewed women. Greek society viewed women in a very ambivalent manner. Historically, women were seen as creators, as expressed in Greek mythology, where women were considered to be goddesses, and especially in terms of the creation of Earth. Male gods often were represented or depicted as having a rational role. In spite of how Greek mythology viewed women, in Greek society, though, laws were often repressive towards women. Not much changed in Roman society, in spite of things that were talked about by Cicero and the ideas of the nature of man and the role that man should play in the greater scheme of things. Women were considered to be minors of their fathers or husbands. In other words, women were considered to be subordinate to men. Medieval Europe, with its feudal systems, created again the idea of women that were subjugated based on church theology and the idea that God created man and women not in an equal sense. This idea of the subjugation of women can be seen both in terms of literature as well as depiction of women in society during medieval times. During the Renaissance period, women were seen as virtuous and not worldly. And so laws were created in a sense to keep women in their homes to protect them, to protect that virtuous element of a woman. In the 16th century, historically, Christian faith reinforced the concept of domestic patriarchy. And the idea of domestic patriarchy was the idea that men were sovereign rulers in politics and at home. Thus, in other words, it reinforced the notion that women were considered to be the inferior gender as compared to men. In terms of philosophical thinking, if you recall from our earlier lessons, we learnt about Hobbes and Locke. These were writers who explored the idea of natural rights, rights that were natural to man. And we explored Hobbes and Locke on the basis of the evolution of classical natural law theories and the growth of classical natural law theories to a broader concept of human rights or natural rights. As much as Locke and Hobbes were responsible for many of the ideas that were the catalyst for things like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, women in much of that time were still subordinate to men in all matters. Although Hobbes and Locke concede some rights to women, women were mostly invisible to political writers. There has been an argument put forward that women would not be inferior if they were given the same opportunities as men. So what we see here is that the representation of women throughout history in society has been one in which the idea that males are superior to females has been propagated, has been argued, and in many instances political writers, philosophical thinkers who were, of course, themselves men, had no space in many of their literature and writing and ideas, had no space for women in these contexts that they were presenting about rights. Legal standing for women throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe and the United States were conditioned by sexist views. What this means is that whatever the approach taken in terms of nationalism, in ideas about revolution, often involved ideas that focused on the men. So efforts to secure legal standing for women were subject to this idea that society itself viewed women to be inferior to men. In fact, the founding fathers of the United States independence, if you recall, we discussed this early on when we looked at the evolution of natural law theories. We learned that the founding fathers who wrote about the Declaration of Independence of the United States, who talked about God creating man to be equals, paid very little regard or attention to the very women in their lives. So in declaring themselves to be equal, that all men are created equal, and fighting for the independence of the United States from British dominion, it is quite interesting that that argument about the equal rights of man precluded or excluded women from that discussion. In fact, the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution in itself did not allow for women the right to vote. It was also common during this point in the US history that slaves were sexually exploited by their masters. Again, there is a double subjugation of rights here. Subjugation of rights as a woman and subjugation of rights based on racial discrimination. It is in this sort of context that paradoxically the US Constitution was written, empowering American citizens to have rights of their own. Other rights denied to women included culturally enslavement, sold for marriage, the concept of dowry, which is very common in many Asian cultures, the limitation on the rights of women to deal with property and earnings. In fact, in many societies, it was not legally possible for a woman to actually own property or even to get earnings or an income, i.e., it was legally not possible for a woman to own property, to sell property, or to buy property. It was also legally not possible for a woman to earn her own money. It was common in many cultures for arranged marriages. Arranged marriages, again, deeply entrenched the division between men and women. Women had no choice as to the choice of partner and were subjected to the choices that society would deem right. That a woman would need to get married in order to have access to money, opportunity through the husband. Even in the traditional marriage context, Mothers had lesser rights than fathers. And these issues were seen in early laws that dealt with things like divorce, custody of children, issues of paternity of children. Mothers had lesser rights than fathers. So societal views about family, about marriage, about the role of women, therefore determined the kind of laws that operated in many societies across the globe. We could therefore see that the idea that women were subjected to men on the basis of their rights were dependent on, for example, their fathers or their husbands, as being something that was quite common or universal in its application across cultures, across societies, across jurisdictions. Some of these elements remain in some cultures and societies in the world today. We see this on the basis of the fact that in many societies even today, it is a traditionally accepted norm that women should not be receiving education. In some cultures and societies, it is quite common to deal with women on the basis that they would not need education and training because their purpose in life was to get married and to produce children, to be a mother, and that's it. There was no real economic value in having a woman. So work was therefore restricted to traditional roles. When eventually women entered the workforce, women were paid less because, again, society had deemed it such that women were inferior to men. Women were also denied the opportunity to hold public office. They couldn't stand for elections. How were they to stand for elections when in many societies, even up to the 19th century, they were not even allowed to vote? So as we can see, the evolution of women's rights through society were very much a reflection of how society viewed women's roles in a traditional concept. So as we can see, there are many aspects of life historically that women were excluded from. Women were excluded from opportunities to work. Women were excluded from democratic rights, the right to vote. A woman couldn't stand for election. A woman couldn't own property or assets. These exclusions were based on the belief that feminine characteristics are not suited for work and that a woman's place is in the home. Women were viewed as lacking logical capacity. Women were accused of being overly subjective and emotional. And because of these attributes, argued to be unsuitable for a career or work. Women were considered not to be full citizens, and therefore it would be paradoxical for them to work. Another element of this paradox is that women were considered to be vulnerable, and therefore it was better for laws to protect them. Many of these views, of course, came from a very patriarchal or male perspective. But in the early development of feminism, for example, the argument of equal opportunities and equal rights for women, there was actually resistance even from women themselves. Culturally, religiously, the perspective here was that women had feminine attributes and a woman's place was in the home. And this view was argued by both men and women equally. Some of these issues will be explored subsequently when we consider the broader issue of feminism and the feminist perspective. In our materials on social changes that caused changes in the law, if you recall, we took the example of women's rights in the United States as an example of the evolution of how society's changes in values and views caused changes in the law. It was only in 1920 that the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution was made, which then granted American women the right to vote, a right known as women's suffrage. At the time the US was founded, as we mentioned, female citizens did not share all of the same rights as men, including the right to vote. It took 70 years for the 19th Amendment to be made, which allowed women to vote. 70 years, and we use the word battle because we are talking about a battle to change societal perspectives and views, a battle to change ideas and notions about gender and gender equality. So it was only in 1839, for example, Mississippi granted women the right to hold property in their own name. But yet, it says here, that right comes with the husband's permission. In exploring this development in the United States, what we want to highlight here is a specific issue of how society's attitudes shaped the law. The law mirrored how society perceived or viewed women. It was only after much effort by women themselves and some men to push for change did the law eventually change. Now, in many European countries, this period of women's suffrage was a common issue. Whether it is in Europe or America, the fight to even have the right to vote was a fight that took a long time to achieve success. In 1957, when Malaysia gained its independence, the right to vote was not something that was an issue with regards to the women's right to vote. Because we had attained independence in 1957, across the globe in 1957, it was not unusual anymore. So women in Malaysia were able to vote. The law merely stated that the right to vote was subject to an age requirement and some other requirements. There was no gender limitation on the right to vote. That doesn't mean, of course, that there was no discrimination or that gender inequality did not exist in Malaysia. But the issue of the political right of the woman to vote was not an issue. Whether women did go out to vote in large numbers in Malaysia at that time, perhaps that may be a factor. But today, it's not a factor. Whether women were given property rights, whether women had political rights, again, in 1957, when Malaysia gained independence, these were not really major issues. And the reason why these were not major issues is because of the complex battles and fights that women had to undergo in different parts of the world to achieve some level of equality. We've uploaded a number of videos for you to watch. Some trace the historical development of women's rights, and others trace the development of feminism. We also have a more current video here and an article that links the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations with the specific element of gender equality. What we wish to highlight in these sets of videos is for you to watch, to learn, and to discover that tracing the evolution of societal change and how that impacted on women's rights remains an issue till today. So here we are at this point in time with the most current video here, and we see that gender discrimination is still occurring. It's still a factor that affects many societies across the globe. Many societies limit a woman's education because that is not perceived to be a valuable item. So women, therefore, in some societies remain subjugated to controls imposed by primarily society, but more specifically by a patriarchal, male-driven approach to how women are perceived in society. Bear in mind that in some societies, it is a collective cultural or socio-cultural experience that dictates how women are perceived in society. And this socio-cultural or even religious experience is one that is driven by both men and women. In other words, both men and women in society consider that women are less equal to men, either from a socio-cultural perspective or sometimes even from a religious perspective. And the religious perspective is not necessarily confined to one specific religion. It is common to have that conception that the gender inequality issue is primarily an issue that affects Islam, for example. But that's not necessarily the truth. There are strong, sometimes Christian approaches to this as well. Before we end today's lesson, we'd like to highlight the feminist perspective. If you consider all the philosophers and the various philosophical views that we've explored thus far in this particular module, you will realize the dominance of male thinking. Almost all, in fact, all of the philosophers and the philosophical views that we've explored have come from men. And the male perspective dominates the theoretical perspectives that we've discovered. So what then of the female perspective? Is there a view that is relevant to the discussion of how society and law interlink with each other? We will explore this in a separate area, a separate focus on feminist perspectives. Patricia Smith, for example, suggests that we don't need a unified vision of society and gender to argue against oppression, disadvantage, dominion, and discrimination. If we focus on the issues of oppression, disadvantage, domination, and discrimination, we realize that the focus is not really about gender. It's not about treating each person equal in the sense of making it a gender issue, but to focus on the issue of oppression and disadvantage and domination and discrimination to another fellow human being. Some of these views and the feminist perspectives, and there are a number of different perspectives that we will explore, present to us a different view of how law and society functions. It also presents to us that society and its views and how society can change law sometimes are dominated by male voices. And male voices need not necessarily be the right voice. We've presented here also links to 2 articles that we'd like you to also read. The first article is by a Malaysian organization that considers itself to be based on Islamic values. Read the article. You have a sense of what the article says based on the link here. The argument presented in this article is that feminism would make women forget their place as homemakers. In other words, this particular organization claims that there is a social-religious function that women perform, and that function is really as homemakers, not as career women, not as political leaders, not as people who can influence society, but as homemakers. Is this view relevant? It is also quite interesting, as we've tried to encourage you to be more critical as you read or view items or videos, to be more critical. Here is a view that is being presented about feminism and the role of women, and the view is being made by a male. So what value do we attach to how a male defines what a woman should do? Do we accept that view or should we reject that view? But bear in mind that the view that a woman's place should be at home is not a view that is exclusively dominated by a male voice. There have been, historically as well, women who argue the same perspective. In fact, if you viewed some of the videos that deal with tracing the evolution of feminism, you will learn that there were many women who objected to the idea of equal rights between men and women. Contrast this view with the view expressed in the next article. This is an article from Sunway itself, and it talks about the 30 Club. The 30 Club refers to a movement that wants to suggest or argue that there should be at least 30% of representation of women in the boards of directors of top companies in Malaysia. Sunway, in this particular article, is suggesting that it, as an organization, has very strong presence in terms of women representation in their boards. So contrast the 2 views, that one view which suggests that women should fulfill their role as homemakers, and contrast that with the view that women should occupy top positions in companies, not just because they're women, but because of the recognition of the skills and attributes that an individual would have in an organization. So as you can see, social values do impact on how laws are created. How do we know this? What we've seen here in this particular lesson is that societal views and ideas about gender inequality or equality have shaped the kind of laws that existed. Laws that only recognize, for example, the right to vote being exclusively a male right. The right to own property. Therefore, the laws would only deal with men who deal with buying and selling of property. It did not give recognition to women. The failings of some early legislation to cover women's rights in relation to family matters. The traditional role of police and law enforcement when there has been evidence of domestic violence or abuse. So these issues represent how society has evolved and changed. For many societies, for example, the Malaysian society, we may not have a sense of these issues because at the time that Malaysia became independent, some of these rights were already interspersed within the constitution and didn't really become a major challenge. But the point is that even today, women across the globe, including Malaysia, still face issues of discrimination. As I said, we will explore this further in subsequent lessons on the feminist perspective. Not to forget that laws define gender very specifically. In Malaysia, for example, we only recognize the binary male and female. And that we will explore when we cover the issue of gender and sexuality. For now, we hope that you do watch the videos, do read the articles, and formulate your thoughts on how society can actually be a successful catalyst to change the law. And secondly, that sometimes change takes a very long time. Until the next time, we'll stop here.